Greetings, everyone. I am Jaffery, and I welcome you to another episode of the CSSPR Conversation Series. Today, we'll delve into a very important relationship, and within that, a very important project. We'll talk about Sino-Pak relations within the context of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which happens to be one of the flagship projects of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is fast becoming a very important phenomenon in regional and global politics, especially in the context of the ever growing and convoluted rivalry between the US and China. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by Dr. Filippo Boni. He's a lecturer in politics and international studies at the Open University in the UK and a research fellow in the European Research Council funded project REDEFINE. He looks at the China's rising power potential and its implication for global development. He's interested in the politics of Chinese investments in South Asia and Europe, as well as in the international relations of South Asia. And particularly, he's focused on the bilateral relations between Pakistan and China and the overall framework of the Belt and Road Initiative. He's the author of a book entitled Sino-Pakistani Relations, Politics, Military, and Regional Developments Dynamics. Recently, he co-authored a paper for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The paper looked at how Pakistan and China negotiate, especially how they look at CPEC and how they frame their parlays in that project. Thank you very much, Dr. Boni, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to read your work. I want to begin by asking a question that I believe is one of the myth-breakers in the debate surrounding the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. You have successfully shown us in your paper that both China and Pakistan exercise agency over each other. And despite the power asymmetry, Pakistan has been very much able to force and convince China to start certain projects as opposed to the other. And this has been the case for both the PMLN and the Imran Khan-led Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf. With all this in mind, what do you think are the implications of your findings about Pakistan's agency on our understanding of CPEC, BRI, and China's overall approach towards consolidating and bolstering its economic ascendancy in the region and beyond? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I would like, first of all, to thank the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research for inviting me and for hosting this conversation. I'm delighted to join you today. The paper that we're referring to is, of course, a co-authored work with Professor Catherine Adeney at the University of Nottingham. And this is part of our ongoing research interest in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So to answer your question, I think one of the things that we really try to foreground in the paper about how China and Pakistan negotiate is that Pakistan's preferences have been really key in shaping how CPEC has unfolded on the ground. And whereas there is often the impression that BRI projects are something that are primarily driven by Chinese interests with little regards for what are the agendas of key political and economic actors on the recipient countries and on the recipient end of Chinese investments, we've sort of try to shed light on this other dimension and to look at it from the perspective of one of the most important countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, Pakistan, and to foreground exactly the fact that, as you were saying in your introductory remarks, Pakistan had agency in the way in which projects unfolded on the ground. So they were not just parachuted by Beijing into Pakistan without any sort of interaction. So there are a number of examples, I think, that we sort of look at in the paper. One are the energy projects, for instance, which in the first phase of CPEC were primarily related around energy infrastructure, energy projects, and most notably on coal power plants. And this preference for coal was very much part of Pakistan's desire to diversify the composition of its energy markets. And it was also very much in line with the goal of Nawaz Sharif's government and his party's preference for energy projects to end the country's electricity shortages, with the aim to sort of try and secure re-elections in the 2018 election, something that clearly didn't work out in the end. But the way in which the focus on energy projects was very much also driven by the Pakistani side and not just by the Chinese one. Another example, which I think would be very interesting to emphasize as part of our discussion, is the port of Gwadar. The port of Gwadar wasn't necessarily something that it was initiated by China. It was very much a story that started from Pakistan in the early 2000s, and that on which China has actually originally expressed some concerns because it wasn't particularly linked to the highways networks in Pakistan, and it was a bit isolated. So here too, we've sort of looked at how the interaction and the negotiations around the port of Gwadar have played out in the context of CPEC. So to wrap up this brief introduction, I think that the way in which CPEC unfolded on the ground, it's really a story of interactions, negotiations, rather than being projects imposed by Beijing's agendas where Pakistan had little say in it. It's actually the opposite. And throughout by tracing the evolution of CPEC from the PMLN government to the PTI one, we were able to show that some degree of continuity in the way in which Pakistan was able to exercise agency. Different ways, different political actors, but the red thread that runs through them, it's essentially the fact that there was Pakistan was able to exert influence and to manifest its preferences very clearly.
Thank you. I think between the gargantuan claims of CPEC and the CPEC is dead narrative, I think this fits in right in the middle. And your answer really adds to what last year Daniel Markey wrote in his very good book, China's Western Horizon, and what later Andrew Small wrote in a very interesting paper where he talked about the delays in CPEC and how CPEC has not lived up to the expectations. I think the slowness that Small talked about is a result of what you're saying, back and forth negotiations, the tug of war between the relative agencies, and I think that really fits in well. Now, taking this forward, we have established that Pakistan has a degree of agency over China. As you rightly point out, that the previous government wanted a coal corridor to be established in Pakistan, and the current Prime Minister, who is leading our climate change rearguard action, is really on the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to these issues. So with this in mind, how do you see both countries taking stock of the security issues that CPEC faces, both domestic issues, be they in the province of Balochistan or in KPK and erstwhile Fatah, or be they related to the simmering situation in Afghanistan? How do you think that is likely to pan out with this agency factor in mind?
I think that's a very timely question and an important one to try and answer. I think we need to answer your question. I think we would need to take a step back and see what the security situation and the security measures that were put in place were when CPEC was announced. The sort of security of Chinese nationals, Chinese investments in Pakistan has been very central in most conversations regarding the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And for this reason, as you know, a security division was raised to protect Chinese workers. But I think as a result of the instability that is coming out of Afghanistan, as well as the attacks that we've seen to Chinese nationals in Pakistan in the past couple of weeks, unfortunately, what we've seen is that now the security measures that were being devoted exclusively to CPEC, there were reports in the media that these security measures were extended to all Chinese projects and Chinese nationals in Pakistan beyond the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So there is of course the commitment to step up security measures for all Chinese nationals and projects within the country. And this is an important sort of escalation of intensity in terms of security provisions that we've seen developing in the past few weeks. So I think that the overall discussions around it are very much driven by both the Pakistani Foreign Office, and we've seen during the recent visit to Beijing by the Pakistani Army as well. And there is this type of interaction and close coordination with the Chinese side to try and secure Chinese investments and projects. This is absolutely one of the fundamental areas that both sides are focusing on, especially given what is happening now with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and all the related dynamics that are coming out of it, this very important development for the region.
Thank you very much. I think this factor would go on to play a very significant role in shaping how CPEC will stand out and going forward. My next question takes us back to how Pakistan's own concerns and proclivities are likely to shape the contours of the project going forward. Pakistan wants to use CPEC as a vehicle of industrialization, economic growth, employment, to name a few other important phenomena that are critical to our economic well-being. With that in mind, do you think that the prospect of CPEC being a vehicle and a conduit of industrialization are increasingly becoming possible, or are they receding, given that there are still a lot of negotiations ongoing between the two countries, and with the JCC meeting just around the corner, as it was recently postponed? So I want to pick up your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's also a very important question. There was in the news yesterday that there is this new steering committee on Pak-China relations that is being formed, which exactly aims to try and sort of deliver on the economic side of China-Pakistan ties, as well as to try and remove some of the hurdles that really are hindering the development of CPEC. So I think that's one to watch closely. And in terms, if I'll sort of divert for a second from your question, if we look at the decision-making process around CPEC more broadly, I think it would be interesting to see how the JCC, the new steering committee, the cabinet committee on CPEC, how all these different decision-making bodies that have been set up are going to interact with each other, and what type of, and whether they are really able to sort of accelerate or pick up pace again on the way in which CPEC is unfolding on the ground. So that's something to bear in mind. But coming back to your question about whether the sort of more economic opportunities of CPEC are going to materialize, essentially, I think it's in the report that we have that we wrote for Carnegie, I think we identify we provided some sort of general recommendations, which I think in the case of Pakistan would apply very specifically. There is, first of all, the need to identify a clear set of national and provincial priorities. So the countries can benefit from the BRI, but it's at the same time, it's very important that when they get into negotiations with China, they know exactly what their priorities are, what their agenda is, and try to push forward with what they think is going to benefit the country. So I think this is something that it's important to bear in mind. It's also important to get local buy-in. So there is a general consensus in Pakistan that CPEC is good for the country, right, and for economic development. But at the same time, it's important, I think, to expand the consensus base to different provincial groups, to all the provinces of Pakistan businesses and local communities. And this is especially important if a province like Balochistan, for instance, it's really to benefit from the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and not just the port of Gwadar and the area surrounding Gwadar. And this is, of course, an area where long-standing grievances exist. So it's also important to win over hearts and minds, if you like, in other parts. So local buy-in is crucial for economic development. One of the things that we've seen, and especially in the second phase of CPEC, is this clear focus on special economic zones to accelerate industrialization in Pakistan. And there has been, the political will is clearly there, but we've seen that they've moved ahead quite slowly for the very reasons that we've been discussing before. A bit of adjustment after the change in leadership in 2018. And so there have been really, and now with the CPEC authority and the steering committee, it would be interesting to see whether more work and more progress can be made around special economic zones. So it's really, if we were to assess the CPEC's potential for economic development, it would be really a combination, of course, of political will on both sides, of managing their security situation that is emerging in the past few weeks, and at the same time trying to widen consultation, get local buy-in in order to make sure that most businesses, governments, communities are able to sort of join in the development of special economic zones and to benefit from the progress that CPEC's economic development might bring about.
Thank you. Yes, there is a clear focus on improving and on reigniting the concepts of special economic zones in Pakistan. The current government has really shown its commitment to completing special economic zones under CPEC. Yesterday, there was a news that the Faisalabad Special Economic Zone has completed one of the milestones in its progress. So this is a very important phase that we are looking at. There's just one comment to make before I go on to my next question. I think it is always good that rather than chase lofty goals just for the sake of it, it is important that countries tailor their expectations and their goals in accordance with ground realities. So the slowness, the dithering, the recalibration or the reassessment is all part of a process of making a particular project more people friendly or more in line with your capability mix or the spectrum of propensity that you have as a country to undertake a certain venture. It would not have been ideal for both countries to go for something that wasn't really up to their scale, or they weren't ready for that. So while you can talk about delays, about non-completion of projects, it's always good to take this element into the equation as well. Um, Going forward with that, uh, I would just like to touch upon another important element. It is that we have seen a lot of media propaganda regarding CPEC, both for and against.
Mhm.
And given the importance of strategic communications in this day and age, and also the fact that CPEC is in the eye of the storm. The Americans have talked about CPEC. The Indians are all up against CPEC. Uh, how do you look at the media side of the equation? How can Pakistan and China come up with an effective communication strategy to both allay concerns and to project a very quote unquote correct image of CPEC and a very veritable image of CPEC, so that the expectations are toned down and the reality comes to the fore?
I think that's an important question as well, and I think it points to one of the things that, especially in the first phase, what we saw was that at times the rhetoric and the numbers around CPEC weren't necessarily matching the reality. So you would hear claims about 62 billion, 70 billion dollars. It's much it's still huge, but it's much less. So it's also managing expectations around CPEC and what CPEC actually is. I think that's one of the important things. So rather than making big claims about what, billions of dollars, it's important to show how individual and single projects are moving forward, making progress, like it was the case, for instance, for the coal power plants. And some of these were finished even ahead of schedule. And of course, there was a lot of publicity around it. I mean, to be fair, the impression by looking at the primarily the English language media in the Pakistani newspapers, the Express, Tribune, Dawn, there is a general impression that, I mean, there is a general positivity around CPEC and the development it might bring forward. And I've seen also on Twitter the CPEC making progress hashtag, which is quite popular as well. So I think there are attempts to try and build a positive image as far as CPEC is concerned. One of the things, again, and it goes back, I think, to one of the points that we were making earlier, is the idea to try and widen participation also in this process of trying to promote an image of CPEC that would match reality more closely. And so by bringing in different types of groups, different types of stakeholders, and maybe foregrounding the voices of people who have directly benefit from it, whether it's local communities, whether it's businesses, and so on and so forth, I think it would give a more tangible impression of CPEC that is not just coming from the politician or other key actors, but that it would really be a bottom-up perspective. And I think this would also be very much in line with what the PTI government is trying to promote, as you were saying before, this idea of socioeconomic development and trying to align Pakistan's real capacities with what is actually being developed in special economic zones. So I've been observing attempts to try and build this positive image of CPEC, but here again, trying to open it up a little bit and widen the base around which these messages are being promoted. I think that would be an important element, not just for the consensus within Pakistan, but also to project in the region an image of CPEC that it's that it's tangible and that it meets the realities on the ground.
Yes, thank you. I think part of the communication strategy should also focus on how to project the project within the country. And we need to communicate with the people of Pakistan as to what the project actually entails and what are the benefits of its timely completion. I think that is something that Pakistan has to focus on, and in a very strategic and in a very structured manner. The structure is perhaps not um, there as yet, but that is important if Pakistan has to effectively, you know, project and promote CPEC within the people who will actually get to benefit from it when it's actually completed. I have two last questions. Um, our director, Dr. Rabia Akhtar, in 2019 did a study for the FAS on Pakistan's regional connectivity potential. And one of the things that she pointed out was that CPEC is not the be all and the end all of Pakistan's bid to improve its connectivity in the region and beyond. And this is now coming to the fore in the shape of Pakistan looking at geo-economics as an anchor of its foreign policy, with economic security very much grounded in in that framework. Uh, how do you think can China facilitate Pakistan's connectivity push other than bolstering this project? How can China facilitate Pakistan's forays in Central Asia? We saw recently Prime Minister Imran Khan lay great emphasis on that factor during his visit to Uzbekistan, uh, and I think the question becomes critical to answer because there is this lack of understanding on part of various actors probably and people here in Pakistan that our connectivity is only tied to CPEC. So this is what I had to pick your brain.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think it's important to sort of echo your point about the fact that connectivity, it started well. The idea of trying to connect Pakistan with other parts of the world started well before CPEC, and it will continue after CPEC. If we look at the port of Gwadar, one of the rationales, both in the early 90s and then again when it was really starting to pick up in the early 2000s, was exactly to trying to connect Pakistan to Central Asia. And yes, China was involved, but CPEC wasn't really even in sight, right? So I think it's important to bear in mind that connectivity, it's, of course, CPEC is the big thing about connectivity, but it's not the only aspect. At the moment, we've been reading a lot about this idea of trying to connect Pakistan also to Afghanistan with the Peshawar Kabul kind of rail links and road links. I think I'm a bit more skeptical about that development as it stands, given the security situation in Afghanistan and the ties between the two countries, which are not great at the moment. So I think that's one of the things that I'd be a bit more skeptical about. But certainly, the Pakistan Central Asia link, it's something that it's absolutely crucial. And given China's good ties and good relations and evolving relations as well as part of its push westward, I think that could facilitate that. One of the forums where this could happen institutionally is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for instance, where potentially there is the potential for Pakistan and Central Asian countries also to meet and discuss about these opportunities for increasing trade and development and energy projects. So that's certainly an area to watch closely. But at the same time, I think in this wider regional puzzle, Afghanistan plays a key role if we were to think about connectivity in the more physical, infrastructural sense. So I think that's an important link in this regional chain of increased trade and economic cooperation that needs to be sorted before something can really take off properly.
My last question relates to what you have alluded to throughout your paper, that CPEC has been affected by the politics and economics of Pakistan. Uh,
Mhm.
we are seeing a semblance of economic recovery in Pakistan. We saw some good numbers being shown by the National Accounts Committee, and Pakistan was appreciated by World Bank, IMF, and others. That despite the COVID-19 pandemic, Pakistan has managed to save its economy and even record a growth. That coupled with the relative political stability in Pakistan um, is something that gives much more space to the government of Imran Khan to take ties with China forward in a very mutually beneficial manner. We have seen that lately uh, Pakistan has vociferously doubled down on its support for China in the international media. Whenever Imran Khan has spoken about China, he has really been supportive of China. So the space that the current government has got due to these economic and political reliefs, um, what will that like? How will that affect Pak-China relations in the upcoming couple of years, and especially how will that affect CPEC?
Um, so I think it's important to bear in mind how the fact that what we've seen, it's a trend that started really in 2011, but that CPEC has really accelerated. Is that Pakistan has really moved closely towards China and progressively away from the United States. And this is something that um, it's interesting to note how also, as you've said, Imran Khan has sort of defended China and into international forums and whenever he's interviewed in the media. So I think that's one important consideration. And I think in the next couple of years, especially now that, again, there seems to be um, a renewed momentum and desire to try and move CPEC forward, I think this is a trend that will likely be sustained in the next couple of years. At the same time, Pakistan is not in an easy position to try and balance its relationship as well with the United States, which is something that we've also seen very recently. There have been meetings at NSA level trying to sort of find a common ground, especially as far as the situation in Afghanistan is concerned. So I think it's in a difficult position trying to balance this great power rivalry and how it is playing out in Pakistan. But I think the trend is clear, and what we're seeing is that Pakistan it's getting increasingly closer to China, and understandably so, given the amount of investment that China has poured into Pakistan in the past 8 years since the first MOUs for CPEC were signed in 2013. And so I think this is a relationship that it's likely, whose sort of strength is likely to be sustained in the foreseeable future. Having said that, political scientists are not particularly good at making predictions for the future, so I think that's something that we always have to bear in mind. But generally, I think this is a trend that again has spanned the past 10 years, and we are likely to see something along these lines playing out in the future as well.
Absolutely. I think it all eventually will boil down to how Pakistan manages to reform its internal working systems and its economic base. Um, that will help Pakistan increase the size of the pie. Um, and whatever Pakistan wants to gain out of CPEC hinges upon our ability to uh, take advantage of what it has got to offer. If we are unable to take the advantages of CPEC due to our internal deficiencies, bureaucratic hurdles, and the systemic issues that come along with it, I think that would then really not be China's fault or CPEC's structural fault. Also, Pakistan is trying its best to balance its relations with the US and China, and Pakistan has categorically um, told DC and Beijing, although Beijing does not need to be told about that, but Pakistan has been very articulate in saying that. I remember Pakistan's NSA, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, he said last year that if one country wants to establish 5 plants in Pakistan and the other wants to establish 20, we are more than happy. And I think this is something that really needs to be understood by other countries. And this is something that lies at the heart of Pakistan's current foreign policy and economic diplomacy as well.
I think it's important. Sorry, just to come back to the first point you were making. I think you're very right in the sense that it's important, and it goes back to one of the key recommendations as well that we make in the paper, is this idea exactly to know exactly what the priorities, a clear set of national and provincial priorities, and trying to push ahead with those and align those with the capacity on the ground to deliver on what is agreed centrally with the Chinese counterpart, and that's really the key to a sustained evolution of CPEC, that it's in line with what the Pakistani government seeks to address and what the people of Pakistan would need.
Thank you very much, Dr. Filippo, for joining me in this conversation. It was a very succinct, yet a very wide-ranging conversation, I must say. I look forward to engaging with you further. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me, and I look forward to other opportunities of having these conversations about China-Pakistan relations and CPEC.
Likewise, thank you.